Unmasking Ed by Flawedamethyst. Notes. Written for Our Flag Means Death Reverse Bang, inspired by the art of Isabelle Hemlock, who was great for kicking ideas around with and who also kindly baited. I had so much fun collaborating with her. Chapter 1. It wasn't simple being Blackbeard anymore. It had been, for a bit. Or, well, it had felt like it should be. Things should be simple for the Kraken, surely. Kill, maim, delve into the worst a person could be, all that. He'd accepted this was who he was, the only version of himself that anyone wanted, so why was he finding himself spending more and more time curled up in a ball of misery in Stede's gutted cabin? Izzy knocked before coming in now, which meant Ed had time to pull himself together and sit up, as if he'd been staring out at sea, rather than pressing his face into his knees. He didn't look around when Izzy spoke. "There's a ship headed our way. Looks a bit on the small side to be carrying much of value, but it might be worth a raid anyway. Give the crew something to do." Ed shouldn't be hesitating over giving the go-ahead. This was what he was for, after all. Attack some little ship, killing everyone, discovering there's nothing worth keeping, and then burning it down for laughs. That's what the Kraken should be excited to do. Ed couldn't remember the last time he'd been excited about something. That wasn't true. He remembered all too clearly the thrill of planning to go to China, of thinking he'd have a future with Stede, no matter how much he tried to pretend that that hadn't happened. Raiding ships was definitely what Izzy wanted him to do, and he was the only person who actually wanted anything from Stede anymore, so fuck it. Why shouldn't Ed just nod in agreement, grab his weapons, and head up to find some poor merchant captain to terrify? What else was he going to do? Build another fucking blanket for it? Eat marmalade and whine about how the pretty rich boy didn't want him? Of course he hadn't fucking wanted him. Who would want an empty shell? "Blackbeard," Izzy prompted. Ed glowered at him before standing up, ignoring the way his joints clicked. He was getting fucking old. Surely that meant he'd get to go out in a blaze of glory soon. Fuck, he was so tired. Just the prospect of getting to end things felt like a balm he didn't deserve. "Yeah, okay," he said. "No cannons. Let's get some hand-to-hand practice in." Maybe somebody would get lucky and stab him. He could only hope. Izzy nodded and left, looking thrilled at the prospect. Ed allowed himself a moment to slump. God, he was so tired. They were shouting on deck as the crew started to get ready for the raid. He took a deep breath. Right, time to get his Kraken on. Get his weapons and his hate and be fucking Blackbeard, that grotesque parody of a storybook villain. After all, there was no one else left for him to be. It wasn't a merchant ship, or a fishing vessel, or even some posh fucker out on a day trip. It was Stede. Stede fucking Bonnet. And he didn't even have the decency to let Blackbeard board his ship. He jumped aboard the Revenge with a drawn sword while Ed was still reeling at the sight of him. He was wearing a white shirt and darker breeches, but no fancy waistcoat, no silky soft coat, no little ribbons or bows or layers of lacy cravats. His hair was still wavy, but it was pushed back instead of hanging in carefully sculpted curls, and the bastard had grown a dashing little mustache, like he needed anything else to make Ed lose his fucking mind. "Ha-ha!" he announced dramatically, posing on the deck. The fuck did he have to look so fucking good when Ed hadn't even brushed his fucking hair in the last week? Not that Ed wanted to look good for him, of course. Stede had fucking abandoned him. He didn't deserve to be greeted with brushed hair. Ed was all fastened up in his leathers, wild hair and black powder smeared over his face. That should be good enough for fucking anyone, especially some posh arsehole who hadn't even wanted Ed in the first place. Fuck. He hoped that eye makeup stuff still looked dangerous and cool as he thought it did, and that he wasn't just a wanker with raccoon eyes. "Ed," called Stede, "I've come for my ship." "Fuck off," yelled Izzy, drawing his own sword and advancing on Stede. But Stede wasn't alone, or unprotected. The rest of Stede's crew were following him over from his ship. And shit, it was all his old crew, the guys Ed had left for dead on that stupid little island. "I fucking wouldn't," said Roach, aiming a cleaver at Izzy, and he growled but stopped his advance. "What kind of fucking imbecile attacks Blackbeard's ship?" Izzy snarled. "Technically, it's my ship," Stede pointed out. Izzy ignored him in favor of glowering at the crew behind him, "especially with a crew Blackbeard has already tried to kill once." "Ah, yes, Ed, I was wondering if we could have a word about that," asked Stede, looking over at Ed and ignoring Izzy entirely. "And maybe some other things?" And now everyone was looking at Ed, waiting for him to make a decision, waiting for him to be the Kraken, or Blackbeard, or fucking weak Ed who had let Stede walk all over him once already, and Ed didn't know which version he should be. What the fuck was he meant to do when faced with Stede glowing in the sunlight like that? He looked around again at the guys he thought were dead, at half the members of his own crew who clearly had no intention of fighting against their old friends, at Izzy's hissing rage and Stede's triumphant posture, and he didn't know what to do. Did he even want to do anything? How was he meant to tell? Everyone was still looking at him. "Fuck," he said, letting it all slide away. "Fuck it, whatever. Ship's yours, mate." He turned and headed for the privacy of his cabin, ignoring Izzy's spluttering rage behind him and Stede calling after him. Fuck it all. He was too damn tired for this. He'd sort of expected either Stede or Izzy to follow after him, or both even, in a worst-case scenario that would have ended with yelling and violence. Instead, he was left alone while he heard Stede's voice call out on deck, loud and clear, "The revenge is ours!" There were cheers, followed by the familiar sharp growl of Izzy's voice, although Ed couldn't hear what he was saying. He drifted back towards the door he'd just slammed so that he could hear better. "Oh, I think we've had quite enough from you," said Stede, his voice still ringing like a bell. Then there was a little thump, a couple of loud bangs, and another chorus of cheers. Ed concentrated, but he couldn't hear Izzy's voice. Hopefully the arsehole wasn't actually dead, although Ed couldn't bring himself to care enough to go and find out. Instead, he headed back to the window seat where he'd been curled up earlier, slumped back into place, staring out at the waves. What should Blackbeard be doing right now? Raging and stabbing and taking out everyone who dared to fight him, probably. That seemed like a lot of effort. Ed tipped his head forward on his knees, giving in to the urge to just collapse into himself. He'd have to be Blackbeard again sooner or later, but right now there was no one else around, no expectations to be met, or performances to be put on. Ed could just let his mind drift for a bit. It wasn't actually that long before there was a tap on the door. Ed lifted his head, but wasn't given time to respond before Stede opened the door. He watched Stede's face as he took in the room, empty and desolate and scarred to shit, just like the lair of a monster should be. Stede didn't comment on it, though, and he didn't look particularly surprised. Ed supposed his old crew would have already told him about the destruction, about the trail of drowning books they'd left in their wake mile after mile. "Ed, I think we should have a conversation, don't you?" he said, moving over the window. Ed eyed him cautiously. "Suppose? You gonna throw me overboard?" Stede stared at him. "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" "That's what pirates do when they overthrow a captain," Ed pointed out. Stede huffed, moved around to sit in the window seat. Ed pulled his feet back to put a little more distance between them. "Ed, don't be so dramatic. You haven't been overthrown." Ed snorted his derision at that, because what the fuck else would you call it? The dread pirate Blackbeard had his ship taken from under him, and he hadn't raised a single finger to stop it. His throne was toppled. "Ed," said Stede softly, reaching out for Ed's leg. Ed couldn't stop himself from flinching away. He was pretty sure that if Stede touched him right now, he'd just crumble away into nothing. Stede's hand stopped before it touched him, hovered for a moment, and then withdrew. He sighed. This may have been naive of me, but I was rather hoping we could go back to how things were, that we could be co-captains again. Yeah, that was pretty fucking naive. Ed still felt a little thump in his heart at the idea at being able to push all this aside and pretend it hadn't happened. It wasn't going to work, though. Mate, you really think the guys I marooned and left for dead are going to want me back in charge? Not to mention what might happen when he found out about Lucius. Fuck, Stede might well change his mind and throw Ed overboard after all when he found out about that. Stede looked around the gutted cabin. I know, he said tiredly. I know that. Really, I suppose I want this to be easy. It's not going to be easy, said Ed, feeling the truth echo in his chest. There was nothing easy about all this romance stuff, as it turned out. He should have just stuck to the fucking arseholes like Jack. Easy it would have been if you turned up at that fucking dock when we were halfway to China right now. He'd spent more time than he'd really wanted to thinking about it, imagining what it might have been like, the cabin still full of Stede's luxuries, them cuddled up together in the evening in silk robes, kissing and laughing and being all affectionate and shit. But Stede had destroyed that future for them before it had even begun. Why weren't you there? Asked Ed, unable to keep the question under his tongue anymore. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the well of emotion surging up made it break halfway through, and he gave up, pretending he could be calm about this. Why the fuck didn't you come, Stede? Oh, Ed, said Stede, looking as if he were just as sad as Ed felt about the whole thing, which was bullshit. No one could be sadder than Ed, and no one could be sadder than Ed that he hadn't been allowed that future. It was just... Stede took a deep breath and then said in a very firm voice, it was because I was a fucking idiot. Ed couldn't help from snorting a bitter laugh at that. Well, fucking yeah, he muttered. It's all a pretty awful story, really, said Stede. I'll tell you the whole thing later, but really, it was just that. I was an idiot, Stede. I should have been there. I should have gone with you, or even just talked with you about my reservations so we could decide on a different plan together, but instead I just did what I always do when things are too much, and ran away. He squared his shoulders and firmed his jaw. No more, though. I promise, Ed, I'm not going to run away any more. I won't keep abandoning the people I love. Love. It was a word Ed had been avoiding for weeks. He gritted his teeth and tried not to react to it now, but his emotions were spilling all over the place, and he couldn't keep all of them off his face, not with Stede staring at him from so close. Oh, how remiss of me, said Stede as he caught on. I meant to lead with that. Ed, I love you. It was the most important thing that happened while we were apart. I realized that this is love. I'd never known it before, you see, so it took me a while to identify it. I'm sorry it took so long. Ed stared at him, eyes riveted to every line of Stede's sincere expression. It felt like something was rising up in his chest, something huge and all-encompassing, something that was going to explode out of him like rage used to. Don't, he said in a choked voice, trying to get a handle on it. I'm afraid I have to, said Stede. I promised myself I would, you see. I love you, Ed, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this between us. The emotion burst out of Ed, and he was horrified to find it was a sob, loud and burning his throat as tears rushed to his eyes. Fucking Stede Bonnet and his fucking pretty words and fuck. Ed was crying properly now, heavy and choking like it always was these days. He curled up tighter, clutching his legs to himself and pressing his face into his knees, trying to hide everything that was spilling over. Oh, darling, said Stede, sounding heartbroken. Oh, Ed, I'm so sorry. Are you... May I touch you? Please. Ed shook his head because it felt like the only thing holding him together right now was the distance between them. If Stede touched him, it would be all over. Ed, I'm so sorry, said Stede. Please, tell me what I can do to help. Ed shook his head again, tears smearing across the leather of his trousers. Can't fucking do anything. he managed to get out between the sobs. "We're fucking fucked, mate." "I don't believe that for a moment," said Stede. "We're a bit of a mess, yes, but I truly believe we can fix it, together, if you still want to try." Except they couldn't, because maybe they could talk shit through, and maybe the crew would one day forgive Ed, and maybe they could fill the cabin back up with new books and fancy shit. But there was always going to be the one thing that was never going to come back. "I killed the boy," he said, lifting his face so he could see Stede's face as he realized just how broken things were. Maybe it was a bit masochistic, but he couldn't hide from this, not from the worst thing he'd done, the thing that Stede would never be able to forgive. "Lucius, I pushed him into the sea and sailed away. I left him to the sharks. We can't fix this, Stede." Stede pressed his lips together, sorrow lining his face, making him look 10 years older. "Oh, Ed," he said, still in that same soft voice. "He said you thought that." Ed blinked at him. "What?" "Lucius isn't dead," said Stede, reaching out for Ed again, this time following through, settling his hand on top of Ed's boot and giving his foot a squeeze that he could hardly feel because of what? Lucius wasn't dead? "He's on the deck with the others. Or, well, he was. Given how he and Pete were carrying on, I rather hope they found somewhere more private before things got too far." There was a ringing in Ed's ears, and he shook his head to try to clear it. "What?" he said again. "He came out of one of my secret passages once he realized we'd taken back the ship," said Stede. None of this was making sense. Why wasn't Stede making any sense? "He told us what happened, and he said he'd managed to climb back on board and had been hiding ever since. I think Jim and Frenchie have been sneaking him food." "He's not dead?" Ed repeated, trying to get that to sink in. He'd spent so many nights replaying Lucius's exact cry as he'd fallen, the way he'd gone over so easily because he hadn't seen it coming, hadn't expected Ed to turn on him so suddenly and violently, hadn't expected the Kraken. "No," said Stede. "Which isn't to say he isn't furious about the whole thing, of course. Well, if we're being honest, I am as well. Pete definitely is, but it's not something we can't fix, Ed, if you're willing to try." "He's not dead," Ed said again, then took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. Stede squeezed Ed's foot again. "Exactly. He's not dead. The rest of the crew are fine. I'm back. Ed, I'm back, and I want to make this work more than anything." He hesitated, and then said those horribly beautiful, painful words again. "I love you." Ed had to just sit with all that for a moment, trying to grab a hold of even one of the thousands of thoughts and feelings whirling around him. Stede loved him. Lucius wasn't dead. Stede loved him, or, well, thought he loved him, loved the person Ed had been with him, who Ed was going to have to feel his way back into if they're going to try to rebuild what they had. The idea of forcing himself back into yet another shape, even one as soft and easy as Stede's co-captain, left Ed feeling exhausted. He leaned back against the window frame, letting his head rest there where he could keep a watch on Stede. God, he really was so lovely. He'd done something of a tan, making his skin glow against the gold of his hair and that fucking mustache. He was giving Ed such a hopeful, eager look, and, well, Ed was the fucking Kraken. He crushed hope. And he was so fucking tired, so done with all this, even Stede's heartfelt optimism. "How can you love me?" he said. There was a dark edge to his voice now, the Kraken coming up from the depths. "You don't even know me." "Of course I do," said Stede. "Ed, I don't think I've ever known anyone the way I know you." Ed shook his head. "You know who I've shown you," he said. "Blackbeard, the pirate genius. Ed, the guy who appreciates a luxury every now and then. Maybe you love those guys, Stede, but you hated Jack's old pal Blackie. You hated Izzy as well. And he's been formed in the same way the dread pirate Blackbeard was, so you probably wouldn't like him much either if you properly met him. You didn't like poor old No-Beard, who just wanted to fold some fucking laundry. Stede stared at him as if he were speaking in tongues. What on earth are you talking about, Ed? Those are all you. I love all of you. Ed was losing his grip on the Kraken again. He could feel another sob working his way up his chest, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he dissolved into tears again. You can't, he said, his voice getting choked. Stede, how can you know me? I don't even know me. And here it was, right on time, a heavy sob bursting through his chest, his eyes filling up with tears again. I don't know who I am, Stede. I'm just a hollow shell under all these masks. There's nothing here to love. No, said Stede firmly. I don't believe that's true at all, Ed. I think there's plenty to love. Blackbeard, Ed, or whatever you want to call yourself. I love all of you. Ed just shook his head again, tears leaking down his face. Fuck, he was so fucking tired of this. Having Stede back was only making it worse. Stede let out a long sigh. Oh, darling, he said sadly, let me help you. We can work out who you are together, and I promise whoever that is, I will love every part. Even if I chuck more of your crew overboard? Asked Ed, drawing in a sniff and trying to choke down some of his tears. Well, I would prefer if we could avoid that, said Stede. Besides, I don't think you really want to do that, do you? I get the feeling you regretted hurting Lucius. Fuck. So much for putting a stop to the tears. Just the mention of it sent another wave over Ed, tears bursting forth until he was curled up again in a futile attempt to hide them. I did, he agreed through the sobs. I really did, Stede. I'm so sorry. Oh, Ed, said Stede, squeezing his foot again. Please, let me hold you. I want to help. Ed barely managed to nod before Stede was moving next to Ed, where he could wrap an arm around him and pull him to his chest. Ed pressed his face into Stede's shirt, feeling the solid warmth of his chest underneath, and gave himself over to all the emotions running through him. They sat like that for long enough for Ed to lose track of the time. He managed to stop his tears, but he didn't want to move away from Stede just yet. Not when everything inside of him still felt all churned up. There was a knock at the door, and he flinched, even though it hadn't been very loud. Fuck, he needed to get himself together. He was on a ship with a crew that had good reason to hate him. He needed to be on his guard. Fuck, that seems so exhausting. Maybe he'd just let Jim or whoever stab him. Captain, called a voice that took Ed a couple of seconds to place as Oluwalde's. Are you in there? Stede let out a sigh. He was close enough to Ed to still feel his chest shift with the force of it. Can it wait? He called back. Not really, said Olu. Sorry. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be decided now that we're in control of the ship. Stede sighed again. Ed nudged him with his elbow. Go on, he said. I'll be fine. Are you sure? Asked Stede. I'm sure Olu and the others can handle whatever needs to be done. Nah, said Ed, bracing himself and then pulling away from Stede. Go on. Gotta be a captain, right? Right, said Stede, eyeing Ed with a worried frown, but he called back. On my way out. On my way, to Olu. I'll be back as soon as possible, he added to Ed. Ed just shrugged. Take your time. Not like I'm going anywhere, he said. Nowhere to fucking go. Stede still looked concerned, so Ed tried out a reassuring smile, then let it slide away when it felt wrong on his face. Stede's worried look only deepened. I really will be as quick as possible, he said, then glanced out of the window at the setting sun. Ask Roach to arrange some dinner for us, shall I? We can talk more then. Sure, said Ed, wondering what the hell reaction Roach would have to being asked to make a dinner for a man that tried to kill him. You should probably talk to your crew as well. I can't imagine they really want me here. He wondered what he'd do if Stede put him ashore somewhere. He should probably go and find the Queen Anne's revenge, wherever she ended up. But he really couldn't face that. He had a sinking feeling that he'd end up just sitting down wherever Stede left him and staying there until he rotted. The idea of trying to carry on and forge a new life just seems so unbelievably exhausting. No, that's all sorted, said Stede, making his way to the door. We talked it all through on the way here. I made it very clear that letting you stay and not being too violently aggressive towards you was a deal-breaker for me. I didn't come all this way to not get to live with you, after all, and if they decided you had to leave, I would have gone with you. He gave Ed a smile and left the cabin while Ed was still reeling. Fucking hell. What the fuck was Ed meant to do with that? He stayed seated at the window, watching the sun set over the ocean and trying to work out what he should be doing. Was he really just going to allow Stede to waltz back in like this? Forgive him so quickly and completely that he'd even let Stede hold him while he cried? He should be furious. He had been back at the beginning of this whole thing. Well, no. At the very beginning, he'd been miserable. He'd only got angry after Izzy had goaded him into it. Fucking Izzy. Which is when he realized he hadn't actually asked Stede about him and whether or not he'd been killed or if something else had happened to him. He should probably care more about the idea of Izzy's body being slung overboard like so much rubbish, but Ed was finding it hard to care about any of that shit anymore. All the crying and talking had wiped out his emotions for now. He'd try to care about Izzy tomorrow. Maybe. He heard the clanking of buckets outside in the corridors before Stede came back, glowing with delight and clapping his hands together. Right! Roach has whipped up a feast for the whole crew, and I've told him we'll eat our portions together in here. He glanced around the gutted room. I'll ask some of the others to see if we can find some furniture, he said. I don't suppose you kept the set of rosewood saber-leg dining chairs that were under the munitions store, did you? Ed just wordlessly shook his head. No, well, no matter, said Stede, letting some of his good cheer go a little brittle. I always thought the carving on the backs was a little overdone anyway. We'll find something. In the meantime, I thought you might like a bath. Ed let out a croaked laugh. You saying I stink, mate? Not at all, said Stede, which was a blatant lie. He'd been close enough earlier to know that Ed reeked. Wearing the same sweaty leather for days at a time would do that to you. I just thought that getting all clean might feel like a fresh start. Wash away all the old bits you're not sure you want to keep, and then you can try to build yourself up anew. Fuck, when he put it like that, Ed really did want a bath. Yeah, okay, he said, forcing himself to his feet. Lovely, said Stede. Now I had some soap and towels brought over from the Royal James, as she's still alongside, but you'll want to put on some clean clothes after... Do you... His voice trailed off and he looked at the gutted room. Ed felt tension creep up his spine as he debated his next move. But fuck it. He'd thrown the towel and the rest of his dignity. He might as well let all the truth out. Check the wardrobe, he said in a gruff voice, nodding at the secret entrance. The auxiliary one. Ah, said Stede, turning away to pull the splintered remnant of a little model. I suppose it makes sense to use all that space for some. He stepped inside and immediately went silent. Ed felt his shoulders hunch over as if waiting for a blow. Oh, Ed, said Stede, a dazed tone from inside the wardrobe. When he came back out, his face was glowing with affection the way Ed couldn't look at. You kept it all. Ed shrugged. Never know when you might need some fucking silk shirts for, I don't know, a fucking fuckery or whatever. Stede clearly didn't buy that for a moment, but he was kind enough to let it go unchallenged. Fabulous. Then you go, get all clean, and I'll put out something comfortable for you to have dinner in. Right. Right, said Ed, then hesitated because he loved Stede's clothes. He really did. That there were a fair few that he loved, but there were a fair few that he mostly just loved on Stede. Nothing too, not really in the mood for fancy dress-up, he said. Stede regarded him with a solemn expression that made Ed's skin itch. "Of course. In fact, how would you like to come in here and help me make sure that it's something you really want to wear?" Ed thought about the racks and racks of clothing, all those colors and fabrics and styles, and felt his breath catch in his chest. How was he meant to know what to go for amongst all that choice? No, oh good. He managed to get out past the weight in his chest. It was just a thought. Gonna go bath. He escaped from the cabin and into the bathroom where the filled bath was waiting, hot and smelling of fancy oils, and like somewhere he could escape from everything for a few precious moments without anyone asking him anything difficult. Ed soaked for long enough that the water started to cool, scrubbing his skin as if he could slough off all of his old selves, washing the old remnants of paint off his face and the sweat and salt out of his hair. At one point, Stede opened the door just enough to leave a stack of clothing inside with a "just me, sorry," that Ed should not have found endearing, not after everything. It was pretty clear that no matter what Stede did, Ed's heart wasn't going to stop yearning for him, which was fucking annoying. So much for Blackbeard not giving second chances. When he finally pulled himself out of the bath and toweled himself off, he found the clothes were as simple as it was probably possible to get in Stede's wardrobe. Dark gray breeches with a silvery shimmer to them, plain gray stockings, and a black shirt with only minimal amount of flounces and lace. Ed figured it was as close to Blackbeard's style as you could get within the confines of Stede's kinds of clothes. He tried to tell himself that he wasn't touched Stede had gone to all this trouble to pull together an outfit and just put the clothes on, trying to ignore how much easier it was to exist without leather constricting him around him. He did rescue the black cravat from the pile of his old clothes, looping it around his neck where it went just as well with his new clothes as it had with the Kraken's get-up and Blackbeard before that. He dried his hair as much as he could and brushed it back as neatly as possible, then took a deep breath and made himself leave the safety of the bathroom and head back into the main cabin. Somehow, Stede had managed to transform it in the short time Stede had been away. Ed had been away. He'd tidied up and gotten rid of the more obviously broken bits of decor, lit a handful of lanterns to light the place as much as the chandeliers ever had, and somehow managed to find 2 chairs and a little table to set up next to the desk Ed had left in place but covered in stab holes. "Good news," he said cheerily as Ed hovered in the doorway, eyeing the scene. "The picnic supplies hadn't been touched." Ed looked back at the furniture. The table had a white tablecloth on it, covered with an arrange of dishes and cutlery. "Those are for a picnic?" "Yes," said Stede. "They're all folded up so they're easily portable. It's quite ingenious, really. I kept them in a little compartment on decks so they'd be easily accessible in case we decide to eat ashore one night. I suppose the crew didn't find it when they were, well, the crew might well have found them, but if they'd known Ed didn't know about them, they wouldn't have said anything." Stede recovered from the awkward moment quickly, pinning back on his shining grin. "Come and sit down. Roach has really outdone himself." Ed eyed the food laid out on the tablecloth, but he couldn't move. He couldn't work out how he was feeling about the idea of sitting down and having a friendly, or even romantic, dinner with Stede. Not after everything. He'd spent the whole afternoon bouncing between emotions and felt like this was a step too far. Did he want to eat and laugh with Stede, pretend that nothing had happened between the last meal they'd had together and tonight? Or did he want to give in to that anger still rolling in his belly and tell Stede to get the fuck out of his cabin or even punch the grin off his face? Or was he about to burst into tears again, which seemed to have become all too common for him since meeting Stede? "It?" said Stede. The smile slid off his face. "Is everything okay?" Ed let out a tired laugh. "You already know the answer to that, Stede." Ed's face fell further as he looked down the table. "This is too much, isn't it?" he said. "I'm sorry. I always go too far." Ed let out a sigh and finally made himself move out of the doorway. This may be a bit quick to go from hating your fucking guts for abandoning me to having a fancy dinner with you in less than half a day. Yeah. Stede winced and let his shoulders slump in on themselves, as if he were trying to shrink down and disappear. Ed couldn't stand that. Even now, after everything, he still couldn't stand to see Stede sad. He put his hand on the back of the chair, but didn't pull it out to sit down. Look, mate, he said, I know you want to wave a magic wand and make this last few weeks disappear, but it's not going to be that easy. Not for me. Not for the crew. Definitely not for Lucius, I'm guessing. You're going to have to accept that shit's going to be fucked up for now. Stede's gaze ran over the table, taking in the food and the dishware. Then he raised his eyes to meet Ed's. Maybe for a bit, he said. But we can fix it, Ed. Together, we can fix it. Talk it through as a crew. If I can fix things with Mary, and we'd spent 10 years not even liking each other, I can fix them with the man I love. Ed twitched at the L word, then focused on a different part of that sentence. Mary, your wife. When did you fix shit with her? Ah, said Stede quietly, and an ice block started to form in Ed's chest. Yes, well, I did say earlier that it had been a long story. Perhaps this would be a good chance for me to tell it. Ed pulled out the chair he was holding with a violent yank, threw himself down. Yeah, think you fucking better, he growled. Stede took a deep breath and began. At some point during the story, Stede served from the dishes laid out on the table, and Ed did his best to focus on eating rather than losing his shit. He didn't even know who he'd be losing his shit at. Stede, yeah, obviously, but fucking badminton as well, and maybe even Mary with her fucking skewer. Who the fuck would be lucky enough to be married to Stede and want to kill him? And then I found my way back to you, and really, I do think it's better that I've sorted things out with Mary so I can start things with a clean slate, don't you? Fuck it. Maybe Mary had a point. Ed could imagine skewering Stede really clearly right now. No, I fucking don't, said Ed, putting down his cutlery and grabbing for his glass. It was some fancy wine rather than the gut-rot rum he'd gotten used to, but he downed it anyway. I think it would have fucking been better if you'd talked to me about it before you ran off and fucking abandoned me. Stede winced. Yes, I know, but... No fucking buts, snapped Ed. You spend all your fucking time going on about talking shit through, then you keep something like that to yourself. Fuck, Stede. I don't... He took a deep breath, putting his glass down when his grip on it began to feel a bit close to crushing it. You want to try this with me? Yeah? No, wrong voice, sorry. He took a deep breath, putting his glass down when his grip on it began to feel a bit close to crushing it. You want to try this with me? Yeah. That's why you came back, to fucking tell me you love me or whatever and get back to where we were? Yes. Ed, exactly, said Stede, leaning in. That's exactly what I want, and to find something new together as well, if we can. Ed huffed out a breath. Then you fucking need to put your fucking money where your mouth is, mate, he said. You need to fucking tell me shit like this, or any other shit you might be feeling or thinking that involves me even a little bit, or the ship, or piracy, or whatever, Stede. You need to be fucking open with me. He took a breath and felt it catch in his throat. I can't fucking do this again, he added, then jammed his mouth shut so he could get control before he started sobbing again. I know, said Stede softly, reaching out to touch his fingertips on the back of Ed's hand. They were so soft and warm that Ed had to fight not to turn his head over and grab hold of them. I know that, Ed. I promise. Things are going to be different this time. If you'll do the same, yes? Tell me exactly what you, Ed, needs and wants, not just what you think I want to hear or what you think Blackbeard should be doing. Ed scowled at him, but couldn't hold it. Fuck, he muttered, then nodded. Yeah, okay. We'll both fucking talk it through, I guess. Stede nodded and patted Ed's hand once more before sitting back. Good, then. I love you, Ed. And I think you care about me, too. Or we wouldn't be here now. There was a note of doubt in his voice, as if every stupid act of rage and destruction Ed had thrown himself into after Stede left had been as good as a confession. He didn't have to say it himself. He didn't have it in himself to say the words just yet, though, not when everything still felt so fragile, so he just nodded tersely, staring at Stede's hand and thinking about holding it. "Excellent," said Stede, pepping right up. "Well then, as long as we both want to make it work, I'm sure we can fix it. Now, darling, what do you want right now? We could have a little nightcap, perhaps? Or you've been stuck in this cabin for most of the day. We could go up on deck, maybe climb up the main top and look at the stars. Or anything, really, whatever would make you happy." Ed's immediate reaction was to say that they should go up to the main top because that was the one that made Stede's eyes light up at the thought of it. He hesitated, though, and remembered he was meant to be acting on what he wanted, not just on pleasing the person he was with. He took a moment to look into himself, which felt weird but good, like he was checking in with some guy he used to know but hadn't chatted with for a while. "I think I want some alone time," he realized. "It's all been a lot. I think I need to think shit through." Stede nodded. "Of course, that makes sense," he said. "It has been all a lot, hasn't it?" He stood up and looked down at the plates and glasses littered over the table. "I'll ask some of the crew to come and collect all this, and then leave you in peace for the night." He glanced around the barren room, eyes lingering on the half-closed curtain of the sleeping nook. "Do you need anything? There are extra blankets and pillows and things on the Royal James. It would be easy to bring them across." Ed shook his head. "Got all the shit I need." By which he meant a handful of sheets and blankets that were filthy with eye makeup and tear stains, but he couldn't deal with any more fussing this evening. The bed had been good enough for him to cry himself to sleep in last night, and then all the nights before that. It could take another session of it. "Very well," said Stede, giving a little nod as if he wanted to do more but was restraining himself. "I'll see you in the morning then. If you want me to, I could bring breakfast for us, or just deliver it and go and eat with the crew instead if you'd rather, or something else I could bring, or—" It seemed like he might be about to go and list every possible option, so Ed interrupted him with, "I'll have breakfast with you," he said, because he had a feeling he was going to need to see evidence that Stede was actually back after a long night of doubting himself. Stede beamed at him and bounced lightly on his heels. "Splendid. Well, I will see you then." He gave Ed one last sunny grin, then walked to the door, pausing to add, "Sleep well, my love," before exiting and leaving Ed feeling like he'd been hit by a cannonball. My love. Fucking hell. He'd need most of the night just to process that alone. Ed curled up on the bed behind the drawn curtains and steadfastly ignored the sounds of Olu and Frenchie coming in to clear the dinner. He wasn't ready to face any of them yet, not even the ones he'd had on his crew. After they'd gone, he'd slumped over on his side, staring at the moonlit waves and letting his grip on his emotions loosen. Once he stopped crying, he was too tired to really start feeling any other emotions fully, which actually made it easier to sort through everything he was thinking. First things first, Stede was back, and despite everything Ed had told himself while pretending he was angry rather than miserable while Stede was gone, that was a good thing. Just talking to the guy, hell, even just seeing his face was enough to lift Ed's spirits, and knowing he was going to be having breakfast with the guy tomorrow, well, it was hard not to perk up at the thought. While they'd been apart, Ed had told himself that if Stede ever turned up again, he'd either boot him off the ship or storm off to the Queen Anne's Revenge with a clear demand for Stede to leave him alone. Clearly, neither of those things were going to happen. So where did that leave him? Staying here and making the best of it, he guessed. Finding out who he wanted to be now that he was leaving the Kraken behind, figuring out what he wanted his life to look like from now on. He sat there for a good hour or two, staring sightlessly through the windows at the night sky, at all the options and possibilities. As all the options and possibilities ran through his head, eventually he dozed off, still with more questions than answers.